This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1079, a conversation with Ron Marz.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1079. It's a conversation with Ron Marz, who's previously been on the show before, and you can check the show notes to check that last appearance, which I believe was 8 or 9 years ago. This time around, we talk about the recent publication of the DC versus Marvel omnibuses. There was one omnibus collecting a bunch of crossovers, and the other one collecting the Amalgam Age, which was all the Amalgam one-shots, almost all of them, as well as the DC versus Marvel miniseries. Ron Marz was influential in writing or co-writing DC versus Marvel. He also wrote one of the Amalgam one-shots, Doctor Strange Fate, and also wrote crossover between Green Lantern and Silver Surfer. So a lot of discussion of those omnibuses in this episode, and I hope you really enjoy it. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com, rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify and many other podcast catchers that are out there. Thanks again for listening, and next week we'll have a short, the episode's going to come up a little later, earlier than normal. It's coming out on Valentine's Day, and we're going to be talking about Spider-Man Blue with the Book of the Month crew, which is me, Paul Scorez, and Nathan Struck. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Thanks again for listening, and we'll jump right into the episode with Ron Marz. Enjoy. Ron, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
It's hard to believe it's been about 9 years. So nothing much has happened in the last 9 years, I don't think.
No pandemics, no, political tragedies, anything like that. So I'm sure we're just fine.
That's right. Well, first of all, I want to thank you to come back. I know that one of the reasons I'd originally reached out as well was that you have a lot of material that came from your original files, etc., that ended up in two recent omnibuses that I was very excited about when they were announced last year, which was the Marvel vs. DC omnibuses, the one with the crossovers and then one with the Amalgam Age. So I'm very excited to kind of get into a little bit of this with you. I want to go back for a second, though, and say, when they first reached out to you and said that they were going to be repackaging this material, were you surprised to get that kind of call?
Oh, I wasn't surprised. I was shocked. I had just assumed that these would never be reprinted again because obviously you have to get Marvel and DC to the table and you have to get them to agree to this and they have to, agree to how they're going to divvy up everything, from the money to the work to, all the details. And I had sort of made my peace with the fact that, well, one of the bigger projects in my career was just probably never going to be reprinted. And we had the initial, trade paperback collection of Marvel versus DC after the initial issues came out. And I had a box of those and, gave them out as, Halloween, trick or treat, giveaways and stuff like that. And then realized, I probably shouldn't have been doing that. Those are never going to be reprinted again. So when I got an email from DC saying, hey, you can't tell anybody, but we're going to do this and we'd like you to be involved. I was shocked and also really thrilled.
When they reached out, I guess at that point, did they already know how they were going to kind of break things out in terms of the two different omnibuses, and what kind of level of discussion was there? Because obviously there is a lot that comes from your files, especially, right? So I'm curious, what that entreaty was like, and it wasn't just about you producing forwards, which you did, but also having additional material they helped supply as well. So again, what was that process like?
It was, a lot of it just came about in the conversations, once they had contacted me and said, we're going to do 2 books. We're not even sure how we're going to split everything up. Because there was discussion as to whether, the Green Lantern Surfer crossover that I did, which actually served in terms of the last page as a bit of a lead-in to Marvel versus DC. We didn't know whether that was going to go at the end of Volume 1 or that was going to be the first thing in Volume 2. So there were a lot of moving parts, and just through the discussions with the two editors at DC actually handled the volumes respectively. So there were a lot of emails back and forth. There were some Zoom calls, just sorting out what kind of material was out there. And that's when I told them that I had stuff squirreled away in my files, as well as just going over what extras I knew existed in the world, the card set and some of the promotional items, and just a lot of odds and ends that I was aware of, having been involved in the project, that the editors weren't necessarily aware of because, they were, one, they were not involved in the project in the first place in the initial, production of it years ago. And two, because, they were kids at the time. They were like teenagers, or a little older when the book initially came out. So between all of us, we got a pretty good overview of what was available, or what we thought was available. And then it became their job, and to their credit, they did a hell of a job in tracking down a bunch of stuff that we sort of knew was out there, but weren't really sure where we could get our hands on it.
Mm. One thing I know, just as a fan, and I'm curious what you thought, actually seeing it in print, was the alternate fight pages that were included in like the text about how they were kind of reconstructed and put together. And obviously you've written before about how you kind of had to leave things relatively vague, and so that depending on which way you went, it was easy to replace the art. Was that pretty cool for you too, to be actually see these finished pages?
Yeah, because I hadn't seen these pages in 25 years or however long it's been. I had to write an alternate ending for each of the 5 big battles, and the marching orders at the time were write them in such a way that we have to replace as little art as possible, because we were very much racing the deadline clock on all of these issues, because the notion was to get these issues out and into the stores as soon as possible, because the industry had kind of cratered, and we wanted to get the Marvel versus DC issues into stores so that stores could keep their doors open and get people back into the stores and get them excited about comics again. So once we decided we were doing this, we really had to hit the ground running. And I think all of the 5 different battles that I had to write alternate endings for, most of it was less than a page of material that had to be redrawn or replaced, because we didn't want to waste the artist's time with a whole different sequence that was never going to be reprinted. So it was at most a page, and on some of them just a couple of panels. Lobo or Wolverine coming up from behind the bar to grab the cigar, or Cap and Batman disappearing into the sewers, and then one of them coming back up as the victor. So it was an exercise in trying to do that sort of thing with as little impact on the artist's schedule as possible.
Now, I'm going to ask something. Over the years, how much guff do you get from Lobo fans that Lobo lost his battle?
Oh, everybody's pissed off about that. I get asked about that at least once at every convention or signing or something like that. But somebody's got to, be in their bonnet about, well, that would never happen because Lobo's more powerful than Wolverine. And I just say, well, we made it up, so it's okay.
That's so funny. I never got kind of fussed about that kind of stuff, but I understand that there are obviously people who do, and I like that now they have a page that shows that Lobo won, so that's all they need. It's
wonderful that people are passionate about it, but at some point you got to let it go, man.
A question I have, I'm actually going to jump out of sequence here for a second, but one thing that really struck out to me, well, a couple things. One, when I was reading your one of your intros and your forwards, and how important Uncanny X-Men and New Teen Titans was to you, is it kind of crazy that you have a crossover in the same omnibus as that story, considering how important that was to you?
Oh yeah, completely insane. To think that I wrote something that's under the same hardcovers as that thing, which is to me like the, not only the best crossover that was ever done, but, one of the best comics ever done, period. And the comic that brought me back into reading comics, as a teenager, once I had convinced myself that I had outgrown them. I tend not to think about that stuff a lot because it just kind of boggles my mind that I actually did this stuff. The 12-year-old me that was a comic reader, and then the 16 or 17-year-old me that discovered Teen Titans X-Men and got sucked back into it. My head would just explode if I knew what I was going to be doing, honestly, not that many years later.
One thing that really struck out to me reading all these crossovers in the kind of original publication order, and one thing I wanted to ask you about, because it seems very conscious, is that for the most part, they all take place and they just kind of assume that, Gotham always existed on this earth. So there's never really any shenanigans per se in terms of crossing dimensional barriers. But then in yours with Silver Surfer and Green Lantern, there obviously very definitively is. And I'm curious, you've mentioned before, and I think in one of your text pieces you mentioned that it was near the latter half of the process of putting together that one shot that you ended up, knowing that you were going to be leading into Marvel vs. DC and out of that one page with the box at the end. But prior to that, you didn't know that, so you obviously made a conscious decision to have them not occupy the same space and instead, do a dimensional barrier shift, which did mark a difference in how crossovers have been done between Marvel and DC in the past. Was that ever brought up, or was that ever anything that was discussed at that time?
I think we maybe discussed it in a cursory fashion that, are these, does this take place in the same reality or not? And I guess we decided not, just because we knew that the Marvel versus DC was being discussed. I'm not completely clear on the timeline, but obviously it was all sort of right around the same period, and we had probably started on Marvel versus DC right about the same time as we started GL Surfer. But GL Surfer was obviously a 48-page issue, so that was it took us longer to get that finished. And, like I said, there were a lot of moving parts at the time. I think it just made sense to us, that, okay, these are separate realities, but let's just sort of give a nod to that and then go on with the story. The continuity, the separation of realities and all that, to me was, that's a detail, and you can make of it what you want. I don't think those sorts of things are the most important aspects of any of these stories.
That crossover really stands out to me because it really, and I guess part of it's because you had such an affinity and a previous connection with both Silver Surfer and with Kyle, that it feels more consequential to each character, even though, it technically maybe isn't part of canon, but the way in which you handle the characters and their own, personal journeys is really, it doesn't feel like we're just doing a crossover to be a crossover. It feels like it comes more from character, and I guess it's because you had such a familiarity with them. But when you were breaking the story, it's a very personal journey that even Hal still goes on in this particular one shot. Was that really important to you to make sure that it felt like you were really delivering not just slam bang, let's put these toys together, but also doing a more deeper character introspection?
Well, I think that's frankly the job of any story that you do. Whether it's a crossover or a big, summer tentpole kind of story like Marvel versus DC, I feel like there's got to be some sort of character stuff in there, some emotional stuff that engages you as a reader. Otherwise, it's all just, blood and thunder and it turns into a Michael Bay movie where stuff's exploding and it's kind of cool unfolding in front of you, but you don't really care about anybody. So to me, without the emotional content, this stuff is just, lines on paper. So I don't know that I sat down at the beginning of Green Lantern Surfer and decided, oh, well, we should make an emotional story. That's just the job with any story that you approach. So I didn't do anything different than I do on any other story on that one. I just had cool pieces to play with, and the fact that the quote unquote villains were Hal and Thanos just gave me more canvas to work with, because those characters, I think, are really less villains than they are antagonists, and they're sort of convinced of the righteousness of what they're doing, both of them. So they're not mustache twirling villains or bank robbers, simplified bank robbers, as some villains are. So using those characters makes it easy to dig into the characterization of what could be a cardboard villain in these kinds of crossovers. So I had great toys to play with.
For sure. Now, again, in one of your text pieces, you do mention, adding in the last page to Green Lantern Silver Surfer, which in and of itself, as you said, doesn't really make a lot of sense necessarily, but if you read it in context with DC versus Marvel, it makes a lot of sense, because that's where it really all starts. Was that fun for you to kind of try and figure out a way to make it natural, at least for you, where you can include something that is leading to something, even if maybe fans didn't know it at the time?
Yeah, I think I had actually written 48 pages without that page in it, initially. And then once we decided that, and I think probably Mike Carlin, who edited the DC side of things on Marvel vs. DC, Mike Carlin mentioning, oh, we should have some sort of teaser, because that's the crossover that's going to come out just prior to Marvel vs. DC. It's going to be the crossover that comes out prior to Marvel DC. So we should give a nod to it. And it seemed kind of cool and clever at the time. Like you said, in retrospect now, somebody who just reads the Lantern Surfer crossover 25 years later goes, what the hell is this? You're like, why is there a box in an alley? But at the time, it was all sort of threading together. And I did think it was kind of cool that last page would be a non sequitur to you if you didn't know what was coming. But then when you found out what was coming, it would, it turns into kind of a light bulb moment where you go, oh, okay, I get what that was now.
When you received your copy of the Amalgamated Omnibus, and you're going through, I would imagine you've kind of perused the back matter that wasn't coming from your files. What were some of the things that would have stood out to you as being the most interesting kind of process pieces to see at the back of this omnibus? I went through the whole thing as a PDF when it was getting ready to go to press. The editor had sent me, whatever it is, 1,200 page PDF of here's the whole thing. So you sit down and look through that. And I was pretty surprised at a lot of the artwork that they had been able to scare up. Well, there were file, there were memos and notes and that sort of stuff that I had in my files, and they got from Mike Carlin and a few other people. But some of the process art for both Marvel DC and the Amalgam books, I was kind of stunned that we still had it, that people
that people had saved that stuff, and the editors did a great job kind of canvassing everybody who worked on all that material to say, hey, do you have anything? Do you have some unseen stuff that maybe we could get into these books? And from what I understand, everybody was really cooperative with turning it over and kind of, being able to contribute to the preservation of a lot of this stuff. Because everybody was essentially like me, where we thought, well, this stuff's never getting reprinted again. So I think the idea was that, look, we don't know if this omnibus itself, either one of them, will ever be reprinted past this first printing. So we got to get it right, and we want to get as much stuff as humanly possible into those omnibi, because this might be our only bite at the apple.
Absolutely. I mean, again, yeah, some of the memos and the notes, like you're really only going to read that if you're really into process and really wanted to see all this stuff, but it is fascinating just to see how the sausage is made. And this particular sausage, as you said, is, two different companies cooperating with each other. Again, this is, they wouldn't cooperate with each other for a while after this, and then not for a long, long time, which is why something that this feels a bit like a unicorn. Probably one of my favorite pieces, besides the kind of the unused, the alternate fight endings, was the commentary by Todd Klein on the amalgam logos. Even like something as simple as that, I thought was really fascinating and really showed some of the extra thought that was kind of going behind the scenes.
Yeah, everybody, I think back then, everybody really put their best foot forward because you had the sense that this was something special, and you had the sense that maybe we don't get to do this all the time. So you want to, again, you're just getting a pitch or two to try to smoke one out of the park. So you better take a good swing when you get the chance. And I think everybody involved really did that. It was fun. I mean, that was the other aspect of it. It was fun. These were fun books to work on. This is why you make comics in a lot of ways. This is the stuff that this is in my foreword. This is the kind of story that you've wanted to tell since you were 10 years old, and you're, reading comics in the back of your parents' car on a road trip. This is exactly what the kind of thing that inspires you to want to do this as a career.
One thing that I thought was really interesting about your text piece, when you talk about how the original division of labor was thought to be, kind of alternating pages as opposed to alternating issues. And you kind of mention how it doesn't really work because you and Peter David are different type of writers, and it just wasn't kind of jiving. Was that an interesting kind of process to discover that, oh, wait, this isn't quite going to work?
Yeah, honestly, my suspicion was that it wasn't going to work when we started discussing it. And even at our initial meeting was at Mark Grunwald's apartment. The late Mark Grunwald, who was the Marvel editor on the project. Mm-hmm. We met in Mark's apartment in Manhattan, uptown, maybe 110th Street, something like that. Because they didn't want us meeting in the offices, because, well, why would people from Marvel and DC be in the office talking about something? Loose lips sink ships and all that. So we met at Mark's apartment, and one of the things that came out of that meeting was, and I believe it was Peter's idea, let's switch back and forth every 8 pages. And I was dubious just because I thought, well, man, we're different writers and we approach things differently, and how is this all going to mesh unless we really have a spine for the story hammered out, almost like a page-by-page beat sheet, which we did not. We just had sort of general ideas of what needed to take place in each issue. But we gave it a try. I wrote the first 8 pages, Peter wrote the second 8, and we went back and forth like that. and produced a script for the first issue, which ultimately wasn't any good. Was kind of a mess because we were, it was just all over the place. Was probably fun in that sense, but I didn't think it hung together as a story, and it didn't really have any. It didn't have a spine to it. It didn't have a through bit to the story that really engaged you as a reader. It was just a bunch of bits, and when I turned that version in to DC, which was editorially handing issue 1, it was not met with resounding gratitude, shall we say? It was. I actually can't say the reaction that I received when the script went in, and keep this from working blue. It just wasn't, it wasn't cohesive. It wasn't very good. So the decision was made then and there to just split it up by issues rather than this piecemeal back and forth process.
One thing I was curious about, and you mentioned this in your text page about the kind of the back and forth about, what versions of the characters to use, what costumes to, and obviously they went with having it be more modern because it needed to be, come read our books. These are what the characters look like these days. The one that always stood out to me when I was younger, and I look at it and I'm like, obviously you guys had to play with the things you had to play with, was the use of Spider-Man being Ben Reilly, but also going by Peter Parker and not having the hair he would have had in the book at the time. Was that just one of those kind of editorial kind of fiats that you had to kind of throw your hands up in the air and be like, well, we just want to use Peter in some way? Well,
it was I think I was probably the one that was agitating to call him Peter. I was the one that wanted to just use sort of the classic versions of the characters and the ones that everybody knew, the sort of more iconic versions of all of the characters. We ended up with the present versions of the characters and whatever costumes they were wearing, for reasons that I think were justifiable at the time, because, this series was to get people excited about comics and to get people reading the current comics. So if that's the theory you're going in with, well, you should probably show off the characters as they appear in the comics right now, because you want people to read Marvel versus DC, get excited, and then go read Spider-Man or Thor or whatever slightly off-kilter version of that hero was being published at the time. Obviously now we're 25 or 30 years later, and I think we would probably prefer the iconic versions of the characters, but it was very much a project of its time, and I think it worked because of that. But we did run into things like, well, it's Ben Reilly, but if we get too deep into who Ben Reilly is and where he came from and all that, it just became messy in terms of trying to explain all that stuff, and work in all of that backstory that frankly didn't matter for the kind of story we were telling in Marvel versus DC. So we glossed over a lot of stuff. A question, you mentioned this before, but you said how it maybe would have benefited from being able to be a little bit longer because there's so much at play, so much you guys could really play with if given a little bit more leeway. Was there ever, what did you ever hear from either Mike or from Mark about, the agreed upon length as being 4 issues as opposed to 6 or, God help me, 12, something like that? Did you ever hear about any of those types of discussions as to why they ended up zeroing in on 4 issues? I think more than anything else, it was just the production time. If we did 6 issues, it was going to be that much longer. The schedule was going to be that much more snarled. So the decision was made to, all right, let's get in and get out and tell this story and make it a big deal. Make it the sort of the project of the year for both publishers. try to get as many eyes on it as possible, but have it be fairly contained. Not let it sprawl over, well, I think in a contemporary crossover like this would probably be 36 issues over 18 months, because that's how we do things. But the idea for this was get in, tell the story, do a big popcorn event, and then get back out so that the reading public can plug into the Marvel and DC titles that they have hopefully been turned on to by the Marvel versus DC project.
You mentioned in your text pages, and I think we've mentioned it when we talked about this before, that the minute that Doctor Strange Fate was going to have his own book, that you were like, well, that's got to be me. That's got to be my book. A curious question about it is, with the letters pages, did you write any of the letters page for Strange Fate, or was that an editor?
I don't think I wrote any of obviously all the letters pages in all of the Amalgam books are fake. They're all just made up. Like all of the Amalgam stuff is completely fake. Which was part of the joy of doing it, was that we could refer to other storylines and, have editor's notes to issues that didn't exist and titles that were never published. It was just fun. The whole thing was very tongue in cheek. So I didn't write any. I think a lot of the letters pages were written by like assistant editors up at Marvel and DC who were tasked with that stuff and came back with whatever letters got printed. It was all, everybody really got into the spirit of what we were doing. Because I think everybody had, a similar reaction to the one that I had when I was sitting on Mark Grunwald's couch, and he said, and then we're going to do Amalgam books, which are going to smush together Marvel and DC characters, and here's the list. And I think Peter and I sat there slack-jawed, like, this is a real thing? We're actually doing this? When that information reached the rest of the editorial staffs at both companies, because none of the editors knew that this was coming until it was announced, until everything was in place and all the contracts were signed. None of the staff at Marvel and DC knew it was going on until it was shared with them. But look, you work in editorial at Marvel or DC, you do it because you love comics. Nobody goes to work at Marvel and DC because they're making crazy money. Editorial at both places, at any comic publisher, is a hard job that doesn't pay enough. And everybody there is doing it because they love comics. And this was a pure love of comics type of assignment for everybody. So everybody pitched in. I
will admit to something that I've admitted to other people in the past when we've talked about Amalgam and this era, is that I was 11 years old and I got suckered. I thought this was like a company I'd just never seen the books for before. Like it's almost naive and embarrassing to say it now, but, I bought into this hook, line, and sinker. I read the letters pages and I loved this sense of this world. And I'm like, I want to see more of this. And then obviously I realized, it's not an actual thing. I can't read more of this. But I always appreciated the effort and care that went into it. As you said, that, right down to the letters pages where there was so much detail that you felt like this was, a real thing. And not just, a fun promotional thing that was happening for a month. Now, yeah, anyways, that's all I want to say, and admit to that, that you got me.
I think that's the finest compliment ever, right? That you guys bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, absolutely. Question that I have that I've always been really intrigued by and really liked about Marvel vs. DC, and an element that I don't think needed to be there, but I always really appreciated and enjoyed, was the romance between Jubilee and Robin. I just love that. And I'm just curious, like, it doesn't seem like, obviously a lot of other elements in Marvel vs. DC definitely come out of, well, we're going to be putting these characters against each other, et cetera, et cetera. But that one didn't seem like it needed to be there, but it felt like a really interesting flourish and an exploration of both characters. So I'm just curious, was that something that came from you, from the editorial, from Peter? Like, where did that come from?
I'm pretty sure that one was all me. Again, because I wanted some sort of emotional stakes here, and I wanted character stuff. To me, I'm a character first writer, not a plot first writer, or a concept first writer. I'm not saying one way is better than another. I'm just saying that's how I approach these things, and that's how they work for me. So when I started working on this thing, I wanted to figure out, well, how can we make the readers care? Fight scenes are great, right? And it's cool to watch Superman and the Hulk beat the hell out of each other, but how do we engage the reader emotionally? Because the stakes of the universes are clashing and the heroes are fighting, that's great, but that's expected. That's exactly what you think you're going to get out of this kind of thing. For me, it was a question of how do I engage the readers emotionally? And to me, the obvious one was rip off Romeo and Juliet. Because that's really what it is. It's star-crossed teen lovers from different houses. And, they can never be together because of where they come from. To me, that was not only fun to write, it was an emotional peg for a story that, probably didn't really have many other emotional pegs to it because it was a big fight scene.
In the third issue, which, you're writing issues 1 and 3, and 3 obviously has a lot of the meat of the actual kind of fights. What I'm curious about is how much thought went into, how many pages were going to be used per fight. Like, some of them are 2 pages and there's 3 pages. I think there's a couple 4 pages. So I'm curious, as the issue was escalating, was that a conscious decision to start with 1 or 2 page fights and then get the fights to be longer as the issue goes on? Almost, it brought to mind for me, Death of Superman starting with an issue where you had, more panels on the page until the end, it's all splash pages, that kind of idea. They're kind of ratcheting up the tension. In this case, having additional pages per fight as you go on. Was that a very conscious decision?
Yeah, definitely. It was, you wanted the reader to feel like the situation was ratcheting up, the fights were ratcheting up, and just naturally you wanted to give more pages to your big deal battles like Cap and Batman and Superman and Hulk. Those were the ones that people would be most invested in, so those were the ones we devoted the most pages to. When you write comics, part of the job is math. Part of the job is figuring out how many pages this scene should take. How many pages can you devote to this thing? And it's about the pacing of all of your action and how you're going to spread it out over the breadth of the book that you have. Obviously a single issue now is 20 pages. The job is to figure out how to best utilize that 20 pages. Comic writing is, in a lot of ways, an exercise in real estate, in figuring out how you're going to use the real estate. So, certainly for issue 3, I sat down and figured out the real estate ahead of time and figured out, okay, who gets how many pages? How are we going to parse this out so that we're making the best use of the space we have? Because I think it's a 32-page issue. You have to figure out how to best spend those assets. Because you don't sit down and go, oh, well, we're supposed to have 32 pages, but I really feel like I need 38 to make this issue work. That's not how this thing goes. You don't get to add pages because you feel like it. One, because it's adding money to the budget, but also, and more importantly, it adds time to the production of the book. You can't tack on another 2 weeks of deadline because you feel like adding 6 pages.
I remember in the third issue, in the first couple pages, you have Jubilee writing in her diary about what's happening. And then you have these really nice kind of bigger splash pages where you can just kind of let the art kind of show, the different kind of analogs up against each other. And I always just really appreciated that when I was younger because I just thought it was, how often do you get to see Hawkeye and Green Arrow, shooting arrows next to each other or, that kind of stuff, or Black Canary and Black Widow standing next to each other as if they're, they're about to fight someone. Even if we don't necessarily see them in context of the story, having a moment like this where you can kind of let these things happen without having to anchor it in the actual story and just have Jubilee writing a story about what's happening, I always thought was a nice trick and definitely a nice thing for a fan to be able to see all these characters quickly all together on the same page.
Well, it was really an exercise. It's a narrative device that lets us, or, let me as the writer, figure out how to show as many different pairings as possible. Because this was, this was probably it. We weren't going to get a chance to do this again. So in the issues that I wrote, the majority of issues 1 and 3, I kibitzed on Peter's issues 2 and 4. I tried to work in as many different pairings visually as possible. Just because I felt like that's what people were showing up for. They were showing up to see something that had never been shown before, like Green Arrow and Hawkeye next to each other. Or the Thing and the Human Torch and Martian Manhunter and I can't even remember, and Firestorm maybe, being paired up with with just a visual. So it became an exercise in, all right, what sort of narrative device do I have to come up with that gives me a reason to show all of this stuff at once? So it's, I think in issue 1, maybe we did a Clark Kent story, or maybe it was a Lois Lane story in the paper that allowed us to show a bunch of different things. And then in issue 3, it was Jubilee's diary.
As I said, I always thought it was a very clever device and something I liked. A question I have, because as you mentioned, like obviously you're aware of what Peter's doing with issues 2 and 4. You guys are obviously conferring with each other anyway to a degree. I'm curious what you thought of something that I've always liked that Peter David wrote, although maybe you had input on it as well, is each other. They take a moment and they pray. Interesting beat, and not something you would typically see in a slam bang, action, a slugfest.
I think that was all Peter. I don't know that I had any input on that. Yeah, it was, this kind of project allows you to put a lot of different colors on the canvas, and that's probably one of the reasons we had 2 writers on it, is that I suspect I wouldn't have thought of something like that.
Question I want to ask as well about Access as a character, because obviously he ended up, getting 2 miniseries later on. Was that a hard or easy character to kind of come up with to kind of give him, a reason to be, or like, because he's more of our eyes here as we move through the miniseries. I'm curious how you felt about Access.
He turned into, it was ultimately a cipher, right? We needed a device to jump back and forth between the 2 worlds, and it had to be a character that was going to be new, so that it could be co-owned by Marvel and DC, so that just legally there weren't going to be any difficulties in bouncing back and forth between the 2 universes. So we very much put him, he's got the Peter Parker Clark Kent sort of alliteration to his name, and he probably doesn't, frankly, have as much character as we would like him to have, because he was a device. Because he, while he's jumping back and forth between universes, he's meeting characters who are infinitely more interesting than he is. He's meeting the characters that we really want to read about because he's meeting all the heroes. So it really became a question of, all right, well, how do we balance that? How do we make him our device to get back and forth between the worlds and meet all these different characters? But how do we make him not, just a tour guide? So I don't know how successfully we did that, but we tried to give him a bit of a bit more life and a bit more flesh on his bones in terms of character than just, almost like an anthology host like the Crypt Keeper or something like that. We did the usual, give him a love triangle with a girlfriend in each universe. And we leaned into a lot of classic comic tropes because we were leaning into a lot of classic comic characters, which is why people were showing up.
One thing that you mentioned in the text pieces and is also shown in some of the, kind of the memos and stuff is the idea that originally the idea was for a Marvel character to end up in a DC universe and vice versa. And obviously that didn't end up happening, because obviously there's a lot of legalities and that kind of stuff. Do you wish that had happened, that opportunity had ended up being something that could have been carried through with?
Oh yeah, I think that would have been fascinating. And we specifically ended up talking about characters who, in some ways, were a bit redundant in their home universes, which were Martian Manhunter and She-Hulk, who both happen to be green. I don't know that played into it, but we ended up with a couple of green characters. Essentially, excuse me, She-Hulk is, the Hulk, but a she. And Martian Manhunter is, to a great extent, Superman in terms of the power set with a big brow. So they are somewhat redundant in their own universes. But if you put them into the other universe, suddenly they're completely unique. There's nothing like them. They would have been great additions to Justice League or Avengers for a year while they were sort of on loan, and then the idea was that we would have swapped different characters out every year and just kept the gag going. But logistically and legally, it just became too much of a landmine that both publishers said, yeah, we're not going to do that.
It's interesting looking back on that type of stuff now, especially with the rise of collected editions and how, people are trying to, fill up their libraries with, the books that they read when they were younger, et cetera. And that kind of thing also would have been a landmine. I mean, that's why for years it was difficult to, still is, to find, was the Power Man and Iron Fist issue that involved Rom. Well, it's heavily edited whenever you see it in any kind of collected edition because they just don't have the rights to Rom, although obviously they're reprinting stuff right now, so maybe that's different. So it's interesting to imagine a world where that had happened, and then that stuff probably would have been its own landmine in terms of reprinting that whole period as well. If something like that had happened, it's interesting also to consider that in the mid-90s, I mean, Juggernaut left the Marvel universe for a while, and he was in the Malibu universe because obviously Marvel had bought Malibu, and then that experiment didn't last, and then that whole universe was shuttered, and suddenly Juggernaut was right back where he belonged.
Well, I think a big part of it is that when we initially did these stories in the 90s, this was just comics. You could do that sort of stuff because, and even into the, back to the 70s where Marvel characters appeared in Micronauts and in ROM and these essentially toy tie-in comics. It was just comics. You were trying to get as many people to pick up your comic as possible, and it was only a comic. obviously now we live in a much different media age where all of this stuff is multi-platform, multi-billion-dollar franchises. And so there's a lot more riding on it. Everything is worth a lot more than it was back then. I'm not saying that that's better or worse. It's just we're playing on with a different set of rules now. And, it makes what we did back then, which was just fun in comics, legally difficult now. It's, to me, it's like one of my favorite shows as a kid was WKRP in Cincinnati, CBS sitcom. And you really can't watch those episodes now with the original music on them because they don't have the rights to use that music anymore. So if if the original episode had the Doobie Brothers or Bob Seger as part of the episode, now it's just some like easy listening crap that really kind of distracts you from what's going on. Same kind of thing where it's just back then it was you were just making a show or making a comic, and now it's I guess once you get lawyers involved in anything, it gets more complex.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, because we're nearing our time here, one thing I do want to mention that you did over the last few years that I really enjoyed was your series of, I guess I'm going to call them the Rebirth trilogy. So you had Silver Surfer Rebirth, Warlock Rebirth, and Silver Surfer Rebirth Legacy. Just tremendously fun miniseries that you were putting together with you and Ron Lim. So I just want to thank you for putting those together because those were so much fun. I'm glad that you were able to write these characters again. It felt like you'd never left. They were really enjoyable books. Oh,
thanks. It was a lot of fun and kind of unexpected. Marvel just called one day and said, "Hey, you want to come do this thing?" And I said, "Well, I will if Ron Lim will." And unknown to me at the time, they had called Ron Lim, and he said, "Well, I will if other Ron will." So it came together very, very easily and very simply. And it was a little odd initially because I had not written The Surfer in a while. I think maybe I wrote like a weird version of The Surfer in one of the the Guardians of the Galaxy anniversary issue that Andy Lanning and I did, but I hadn't really written The Surfer to any great extent in a number of years. And putting pen to paper for that first issue was a little odd. And I just, oh man, I haven't flexed these muscles in a while. But honestly, after about a half dozen pages, it seemed very natural. And then as soon as the first batch of Ron Lim's pencils came in to my inbox, I was like, oh, this is like falling off a bike. This is just what we do. We found our rhythm. We found the same rhythm that we had on our run on the book, in very short order. It was really getting the band back together and, going out on a greatest hits tour, I guess.
I really enjoyed your use of Genisvel because he's a character I always liked, but it was nice to kind of see this younger, more brash version of Genis before he became, the Captain Marvel that Peter David wrote. And so I especially enjoyed how you were able to take that character and really do new things with him, even with, I guess, technically an older version of him, younger, you know what I mean? A younger version of that character, I thought was really interesting and enjoyable.
That was actually a request by the editor. It's not like I came in and said, oh, the world needs my Captain Marvel version. I must put him in front of the audience again. I didn't really go in thinking that. And the editor, on the book said, hey, can you put him in there? And I'm like, well, we created him, so I guess we can. And I still don't know specifically why the editor requested him to be in there, other than he just liked the character. I mean, sometimes, actually more than sometimes, fairly often, you do stuff in comics just because you like it. That's one of the cool aspects of this job is, hey, I want to get this in there somehow, and you figure out a way to do it. I mean, that's why one of the later issues has opens with a sequence of Spider-Man and Daredevil in Manhattan, and which really has not a damn thing to do with a cosmic story starring Silver Surfer. But I kind of felt like writing those characters, and I figured out a way to work it into the story so that I could get away with it for 4 or 5 pages.
When you're writing those books and you are operating in the auspices of, a miniseries, does it change how you interpret or come to the story? Or is it just, you're just telling a story and you just know a finite amount of issues it can run?
No, I mean, the job's the same, really, kind of whatever way you do it. Whether you're doing it on, well, I was going to say whether you're doing it ongoing, but honestly, there aren't that many ongoings in comics anymore. There are very few series, unless you're working on something that is just going to go on, like the Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, X-Men. Those books are not going to go away. To great extent, what you get with most other properties in a shared universe like Marvel and DC is you get 4 or 5 or 6 issues initially, and then if it does well enough, you get to continue. Or you get to start over at number 1 and do another, 4 or 5 or 6 issues. That's just the publishing paradigm that we're operating under now. So you to a great extent, you are working on a miniseries, whether it says it's a miniseries or not. The exceptions are the sort of the legacy books that are going to be there for a while. So you're very often in the position that you're getting basically a trade paperback, whether it's 5 or 6 issues worth to tell your story. So you have to figure out how your story is going to play out over that number of issues. And then by the time you're working on the last issue of that batch, whether you're going to go on, so whether you can let threads from those stories play out and leave some trails for you to track down in the ensuing series, or if you got to wrap everything up.
Mm-hmm. I think the last words you had Silver Surfer say in the last miniseries you wrote was that we're all of us on our own journeys. We are teachers and students, heroes and villains. What matters is that the journey never ends. There are always more stories to be told. And that definitely felt like you were talking about yourself, about writing. Is that apt?
Oh yeah, I mean it's very sort of meta commentary, and when we were doing that last issue, we didn't know whether we were going to be doing more or not. Everything was sort of up in the air because a lot of editorial chairs are being moved around up at Marvel, and we didn't know if there was going to be an additional miniseries, and frankly, we still don't know. So I wanted to end that issue with a sense of conclusion, but not a sense of completion. The fact that there are always more stories to tell was apt for that particular series of Surfer stories, but it's apt for, comics in general, life in general. There's always the next one. And whether it's a next Silver Surfer story or the next thing that I or Ron Lim happen to be working on, whether it's together or separately, that's kind of what comics as a whole are, is that it's just a vehicle and it really never stops. It just keeps going, and you as the reader get on and off as you can, but the stories just keep going.
It did feel very, very in line and very in keeping with who Silver Surfer is as a character. He was the one who said it. Like it felt very apropos of what his outlook would be.
Well, it's, obviously he is thanks to Stan very much. He is the character who philosophizes and is prone to making those sorts of highfalutin statements because Stan was very much a fan of that stuff. A little purple prosy. So I guess I leaned into my inner Stan for the last few pages of that issue.
Ron, thank you so much for coming back. It's been, as I said, almost 9 years, but I appreciate you coming back and doing such a deep dive and talking about Amalgam and Marvel vs. DC. This has been a real pleasure for me. So I really thank you, and I thank you for all the material you supplied in the omnibus, because it really adds so much to the reading experience. Because I think when everyone saw that they were going to reprint this, I don't think anyone maybe expected the depth of the extras. I think we were lucky enough to have it all reprinted at all, let alone with, extra content, and the fact that it's there, just makes it, more of a kind of once in a lifetime package that this is actually happening. So thank you for everything that you, put into that and all the extra material that you helped contribute.
Well, thanks. I mean, certainly thank, Alex Gaylor, who was the editor on, the Amalgam Omnibus, who really went above and beyond to track down all that stuff. Again, anybody who's working on this is a fan, and they really wanted to put their best foot forward with this book, and I absolutely feel like they did. If you're going to spend $150 on a book that you could frankly kill a man with, it's of such a size and such a weight that if you really had to, you could commit murder with this book. We wanted to make sure that that for that kind of money you were getting absolutely your money's worth with stuff that you hadn't seen before.
I definitely think that they succeeded, and again, thank you for everything that you did both back then and now that went into these volumes.
My pleasure. I always tell people it's better than having a real job, so we're just going to keep doing it.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much.
You got it. Let's do it.